My wife had been dead for less than 20 minutes when I called our only son. I was still sitting beside Patricia's bed. Her reading glasses rested on the nightstand. The blanket she had pulled over her knees every evening was still warm. "Scott," I said, "your mother died this morning." Silence. I waited for him to ask if she suffered. He didn't. I waited for him to ask if I was alone. He didn't ask that either. Instead, my 42-year-old son cleared his throat and said, "So, what happens to the house?" My hand tightened around the phone. 44 years of marriage. 14 months of watching his mother grow weaker. And before her body had even left our home, Scott was already looking past me toward the property we had spent 30 years paying for. Across the bedroom, an envelope sat inside Patricia's desk drawer. She had given it to me 2 weeks earlier. "For Scott," she'd said. "Give it to him when you're with Elaine." At the time, I thought it was a mother's final letter to her son. Now I wasn't so sure. "What happens to the house, Dad?" Scott asked again. I looked at Patricia's handwriting on that envelope. "You'll find out Friday." Then I hung up. What Scott didn't know was that his mother had noticed things during her final months that I had missed completely. A strange folder, a plan involving our property, and a decision my son and daughter-in-law had apparently started making before either of them bothered to ask me. By Friday, I would learn how far they had already gone. But the biggest surprise wasn't what Patricia had left behind. It was what I eventually decided to take back. My name is Henry Caldwell. I was 69 years old and 5 years into retirement after spending 36 years as a municipal building inspector, the kind of man who had made a living noticing cracks other people walked past. I had been married to Patricia for 44 years, and until that Monday morning, I had never understood how quiet a house could become while someone was still sitting inside it. Patricia died shortly after 7. There was no dramatic final speech, no last-minute revelation. Her breathing had simply grown softer through the night until, sometime after sunrise, I realized I was waiting for a breath that wasn't coming. I sat beside her for a while. I don't know how long. Her hand was still beneath mine, lighter than I remembered it being when we danced at Scott's wedding 12 years earlier. For 14 months, our life had been measured in appointments, pill bottles, good days, bad mornings, lab results, meals she could tolerate, and the small victories that suddenly mattered more than anything. Half a bowl of soup, 10 minutes in the backyard, a full night's sleep. Then all of it stopped. The bedroom clock kept moving anyway. That offended me more than it should have. 7:12, 7:13, 7:14, as though Monday had somewhere important to be. The hospice nurse had explained what to do when the time came. I had written everything down because writing things down was what I did when I was afraid of forgetting something important. Call the nurse. Call the funeral home. Call Elaine Porter, our attorney, when I was ready. Call Scott. That was the one I couldn't bring myself to do. Our son lived less than 40 minutes away, but in that moment he might as well have been on another continent. I picked up my phone twice and put it back down. Saying the words to a stranger was procedure. Saying them to our son would make Patricia his dead mother. I wasn't ready for that. On the third try, I called. Scott answered after several rings. "Dad?" There was noise behind him. A door closing. Someone speaking at a distance. He sounded distracted, the way people sound when they expect a question about dinner plans or a broken faucet. I pressed my thumb against the edge of the phone. "Scott, it's Mom." He went quiet. I had rehearsed a dozen versions during the night. None of them sounded right anymore. "Your mother died this morning." The words left my mouth and seemed to remain in the room between Patricia's bed and me. Scott didn't say anything. I could hear him breathing. I waited. Part of me wanted him to say, "I'm coming." That was all. 2 words would have been enough. Instead, he asked, "When?" "A little after 7. Another pause. Then, "Was anyone there?" That almost comforted me. I was. He made a low sound that might have been a sigh. I stared at Patricia's wedding ring. I wanted him to ask whether she had been afraid. I wanted him to ask what her last night had been like. I wanted him to ask whether I needed him. He didn't. What he said was, "So, what happens to the house?" For a second, I genuinely thought I had misheard him. My hearing was fine, better than most men my age, according to Patricia, who complained that I could hear a loose furnace vent from 2 rooms away, but somehow never heard her asking me to take out the trash. I still asked, "What?" "The house," Scott said more carefully this time. "I mean, with Mom gone, what happens with it now?" My eyes moved toward the bedroom door. Beyond it was the hallway Patricia had repainted twice because she could never decide between cream and pale yellow. The kitchen where she made coffee every morning until illness made the smell turn her stomach. The back porch where she read library books with her shoes kicked off. Scott had grown up in that house. He had fallen off his bicycle in the driveway, taken prom pictures beside the front steps, brought Rebecca there for Thanksgiving the year they got engaged. And less than an hour after losing his mother, he was asking what happened to the building. I didn't answer immediately. My free hand had started shaking, so I rested it on my knee. "Dad, I heard you." I didn't mean it the way it sounded. That sentence did something to me. If he knew how it sounded, then some part of him had known what he was asking before the words came out. "I was just thinking about everything that needs to be handled," he continued. "You know, legal stuff, Mom's things, the house." Patricia had a phrase for moments like that. Putting a clean tablecloth over a dirty table. I nearly told him the house was none of his concern. The words came all the way to my teeth. Then I saw the corner of a cream envelope inside the open drawer of Patricia's nightstand. She had given it to me 2 weeks earlier. Not dramatically. Patricia rarely did anything dramatically. I had been helping her sort insurance papers when she slid the envelope toward me. "For Scott," she'd said. I looked at the handwriting now. "For Scott, nothing else." I'd asked her when I should give it to him. She had closed the folder in her lap and said, "Next time you're both with Elaine." Elaine Porter had handled our wills and estate papers for nearly 20 years. Patricia had already asked her to arrange a meeting if things changed quickly. That morning, before I called Scott, Elaine's assistant had left me a message confirming Friday afternoon. At the time, I hadn't connected the envelope to anything except a mother's wish to leave her son some final words. Now, Scott was asking about the house, and Patricia had specifically wanted him to receive that envelope in Elaine's office. My hand stopped shaking. "Dad?" Scott said again. "What happens now?" I looked at Patricia. For 14 months, I'd learned that grief could live beside practical things. Medication schedules, insurance forms, grocery receipts. But this was different. This felt like someone had opened a door before Patricia was even gone from the room. "You'll find out Friday," I said. Silence. A different kind this time. "What does that mean?" "It means Elaine has us scheduled for Friday." "Why? Did Mom change something?" There it was. Suddenly, Scott didn't sound distracted anymore. I looked once more at the envelope. "I'll see you Friday." "Dad, wait." I ended the call. Then I sat beside my wife again and placed the phone face down on the nightstand. The house was quiet, but for the first time that morning, the quiet no longer felt empty. It felt like it was holding something. I thought Patricia had left our son a goodbye. I had no idea she had left him a question. The silence after I ended Scott's call stayed with me longer than I expected. By late morning, the hospice nurse had come and gone, and the house had filled with the kind of practical activity that follows death whether a person is ready or not. I signed papers. I answered questions. I chose a time for the funeral home to come. Each small decision seemed to belong to someone else, though my name was the one going on every line. Scott and Rebecca arrived a little after noon. Rebecca carried 2 grocery bags and a covered casserole dish. Scott had a yellow legal pad tucked under one arm. Rebecca hugged me first. "I'm so sorry, Henry." Her voice was soft, and for a moment I hated myself for remembering the questions Scott had asked that morning. She set the food on the kitchen counter, then looked toward the staircase. "You really should be careful with those steps now," she said, "especially at night. I've been climbing them for 31 years. "I know, I just mean things are different." Scott put his legal pad on the table. "We should probably get ahead of the funeral arrangements before everybody starts calling." That sounded reasonable. Most of what they said that afternoon sounded reasonable. That was what made me question myself. We sat at the kitchen table and went over names, music, the church Patricia had attended more faithfully than I had, and which photographs we should display. Then Rebecca walked to the back window. "Your yard's bigger than I remembered." She was looking past the maple tree toward the rear fence. "It hasn't grown." She gave a small laugh. "You know what I mean." A few minutes later, she asked whether the driveway had always been wide enough for 2 cars side by side. When she carried a mug to the sink, she looked through the side window toward the property line. None of it was dramatic. Still, I began noticing where her eyes went. Scott asked a different kind of question. "Do you know where Mom kept the house papers?" "What house papers?" "The deed, insurance, tax stuff, anything Elaine might ask for Friday." "Elaine already has copies of what she needs." "Sure, I just thought it would help if we had everything together." That answer was sensible too. Patricia had always kept our records organized. She labeled folders in a handwriting so neat that even 20-year-old receipts looked respectable. Rebecca turned from the window. "Have your property taxes gone up much?" I stared at her. "With all the redevelopment around here," she added. There had been changes in the neighborhood. 2 older homes 3 streets over had been torn down the previous year, replaced by several smaller houses squeezed onto the lots. Patricia had complained that the new places all looked as though somebody had copied and pasted the same front porch. "Some," I said. Rebecca nodded. Scott must have seen my face. "Dad, nobody's trying to talk business today." "I didn't say you were." He rubbed both hands over his knees. "Mom always said she wanted this house to stay in the family." There it was again. Not a demand, a memory. And the trouble was, I remembered Patricia saying something close to that myself. Years earlier, during a backyard cookout, she had said she hoped the place would always feel like somewhere family could come home to. Had I turned that into something darker because Scott had chosen the worst possible moment to ask about the house? Grief can make ordinary things feel suspicious. I knew I had barely slept through Patricia's final weeks. Maybe I was hearing greed, where there was only clumsy concern. That thought embarrassed me. Scott was my son. Rebecca had helped with appointments when Patricia's treatment wore both of us down. One terrible question should not erase every decent thing they had ever done. So I let the subject drop. By evening, the casserole was in the refrigerator. Scott's funeral list sat on the counter, and they had gone home with promises to return the next morning. I waited until the house settled before going into Patricia's study. The funeral home needed a copy of our cemetery paperwork. I knew Patricia kept those records in the bottom drawer of her desk. I found insurance folders first, then church records, then the cemetery packet. As I pulled it free, another folder shifted forward behind it. Pale green, thin, almost hidden. 2 words were written across the tab in Patricia's hand. Mapley parcel. I sat down in her chair. Patricia had called our place the Caldwell House, home, the old place. Even the money pit, the summer, the roof, and air conditioner failed within 3 weeks of each other. I knew every nickname Patricia had ever given our house. Maple parcel wasn't one of them. I left the maple parcel folder closed. That surprised me more than anything. For 36 years, if somebody put an unfamiliar file on my desk, I opened it. Curiosity had been useful in my profession. Sometimes it kept a contractor honest. Sometimes it kept a family from buying a house with a foundation problem hidden behind fresh paint. But Patricia had been gone only 3 days, and the funeral was the next morning. I had cemetery paperwork in one hand, 3 unanswered phone calls on the kitchen counter, and a suit hanging upstairs that I had not worn since a wedding. So I placed the pale green folder in my briefcase. Whatever maple parcel was, it could wait until after I buried my wife. Thursday passed in a blur of black coats, flowers, handshakes, and people telling me Patricia had been special as though I needed reminding. Scott stayed close enough that nobody could accuse him of neglecting me. Rebecca handled conversations when I could no longer remember whether I had already thanked someone. Neither of them mentioned the house. Neither mentioned maple parcel. That almost made Friday worse. Elaine Porter's office was 20 minutes from my home, in a brick building beside an insurance agency and a dentist. Patricia had always liked Elaine because she explained complicated things without trying to make you feel stupid for asking. Scott and Rebecca were already waiting when I arrived. Scott stood when he saw me. "You okay, Dad?" It was the first time since Monday he had asked. "I got here." Rebecca gave me a small smile. "That's something." Elaine came out herself and led us into her conference room. There were 4 chairs around a polished table. I took the one nearest the window. Scott sat across from me. Rebecca sat beside him. Elaine began with condolences, then opened a slim file. "I want to clear up one point first because it affects almost everything else," she said. "The house is not being divided through Patricia's estate." Scott shifted slightly. Elaine looked at me. "Henry, you and Patricia owned the property through a survivorship deed. That means Patricia's ownership interest passed directly to you when she died. You are now the sole owner." I understood the words. Scott apparently needed another second. "So Mom's half doesn't go through probate?" he asked. "No," Elaine said. "And there isn't a separate share that goes to me?" "No." Rebecca leaned forward. "Could Patricia have transferred her interest before she died?" Elaine's expression did not change. "If she had legally changed the ownership structure, we would be discussing different documents. She did not." Rebecca sat back. Nobody said anything for several seconds. I looked down at my hands. Monday morning, Scott's question had sounded ugly. Now I understood something else about it. He had not known the answer. Elaine continued through the rest of Patricia's estate. Personal accounts, household belongings, a few charitable gifts. Nothing dramatic, nothing designed to turn grief into a contest. Scott would eventually receive a fixed cash bequest once the estate administration reached that point. He nodded when Elaine explained it. "How much?" Rebecca asked. Scott glanced at her. Elaine answered calmly, then moved on. I barely heard the figure. My attention had gone to my briefcase. Patricia's envelope was inside. So was the pale green folder. Two things carrying her handwriting. Two things I did not understand. Elaine finally closed her file. "Henry," she said quietly, "I believe Patricia asked you to bring something today." Scott looked at me immediately. I opened the briefcase and removed the cream envelope. Rebecca's eyes followed it to the table. I slid it toward Scott. His name was the only thing written on the front. He touched the envelope but did not open it. "What is it?" "I don't know." "You didn't read it?" "It has your name on it." Scott turned it over. For a moment, he looked less like a 42-year-old businessman and more like the boy who used to shake Christmas presents and ask Patricia if the box contained socks. Then he broke the seal. The first page softened his face. I looked away. Whatever else had happened between us, those words belonged first to a son who had just buried his mother. Scott read silently. His thumb moved down the page, then stopped. Rebecca noticed before I did. "What?" Scott did not answer. His eyes returned to a line he had already read. "Scott," I said. He lowered the paper. The change in his face was small, but unmistakable. "What did she write?" He swallowed. Then he read aloud. "Before you ask your father for anything involving this house, tell him the truth about Maple Parcel." Nobody moved. I heard the heating system click on somewhere beyond the conference room wall. Rebecca's hand tightened around the strap of her purse. I looked at Scott. I did not ask what Maple Parcel was. Not yet. I wanted to see what he would say without help. He folded Patricia's letter once. "Dad." Mom misunderstood. Elaine remained silent. I did too. Scott leaned forward. "She misunderstood what Rebecca and I were doing. That's all." I stared at my son across the table. The moment Scott said his mother had misunderstood, I knew there had been something to understand. I did not open the Maple Parcel folder in Elaine's office. Scott had already given me enough to think about. He and Rebecca left first. Scott said we should talk when everyone was less tired. Rebecca told Elaine she appreciated her time, then walked out without looking at me. I carried Patricia's envelope back home in my briefcase beside the pale green folder. The house felt different when I unlocked the door. Not emptier. I had already learned what empty sounded like. This was something else. For the first time, I wondered whether decisions about these rooms had been made while Patricia and I were still living inside them. I took the folder to the kitchen table. Patricia had not organized it the way she organized household records. There were no neat dividers or labels, just a collection of things she had clearly gathered as she found them. The first sheet was a conceptual site plan. I spread it flat. Old habits took over before grief could interfere. Property boundary, street frontage, driveway access, proposed structures, parking, utility notes. Whoever had prepared it knew enough to make the drawing look serious, but not enough to make it final. I found 3 proposed residential buildings where our house should have been. I stared at the page longer than I meant to. Our front porch was gone. The kitchen addition I had built 15 years earlier was gone. The detached garage was gone. Even the narrow strip beside the driveway where Patricia planted daffodils every spring had become part of a parking layout. I turned to another page. Patricia had written small notes in the margins. Ask Scott what this was. Rebecca said only preliminary. Why our lot? Nothing else. No accusation. No conclusion. That was Patricia. Even when she was angry, she wrote questions before judgments. The next item was a partial financial page with Northline Residential Design printed across the top. There were columns of estimated costs and projected work. I did not study the numbers yet. One handwritten circle in red pen caught my eye, but the page was incomplete. Whatever Patricia had been trying to understand, I did not have enough of it in front of me. Then I found the photograph. It had been tucked between 2 sheets of paper as though Patricia had used it as a bookmark. Scott was a Laven. His hair was too long over his ears because he had spent that entire summer refusing haircuts. He stood in our backyard wearing an oversized Cleveland Indians t-shirt, one sneaker planted on a shovel. Beside him was a young maple, no taller than he was. We had taken that picture the first weekend after moving into the house in 1995. The backyard had been mostly bare then. Patricia wanted something that would grow with Scott. He complained about digging the hole until I told him the tree was his responsibility. Patricia laughed and called it Scott's maple. The name stuck. Years later, when Scott came home from college, Patricia would point through the kitchen window and say, "Your maple is doing better than you are." When he got engaged, we took pictures beneath it. When Patricia began treatment, she sometimes sat in the shade under that tree because the porch became too hot in the afternoon. I put the photograph beside the site plan. Then I understood the name. Maple Parcel. Scott and Rebecca had not chosen it randomly. They had borrowed something from our family and turned it into a project title. For one foolish moment, that almost softened me. Maybe Scott had named the proposal after the tree because he still cared what the property meant. Then I looked at the plan again. I searched the landscape notes. No maple. I checked the boundary. No preservation marker. No existing tree designation. The place where Scott's maple stood was covered by the footprint of one of the proposed buildings. I leaned back in Patricia's chair. They had named the project after a tree their own drawing erased. I did not know whether Scott had noticed that. I only knew I had. There were several pages left. A printed email header with most of the message missing. 2 handwritten dates. A business card. And another copy of the conceptual plan, folded smaller. I opened that one. Near the lower right corner was a municipal reference number. Tiny print. Easy to miss. Most people saw a project number and assumed it was meaningless office language. I saw a trail. Numbers like that existed because somebody had contacted somebody. A conversation had been logged. A meeting had been requested. A concept had entered a system. Maybe nothing official had happened yet. Maybe no law had been broken. But that number told me Maple Parcel had traveled farther than my kitchen table. I copied it onto a notepad. Then I put Patricia's photograph beside me and looked once more at 11-year-old Scott standing proudly next to a tree he had complained about planting. Most people would have ignored that number. I had spent 36 years learning never to. The project number sat on my notepad until Saturday morning. I slept badly, but that was nothing new. Since Patricia's final weeks, sleep had come in short stretches, usually interrupted by some habit my body had not yet learned to stop. I would wake expecting to hear her call from the bedroom, then lie there staring into the dark until I remembered there was no one left to call. By 8, I was at the kitchen table with coffee, Patricia's folder, and my old reading glasses. Municipal records had changed since I retired. Most of what once required a trip downtown could now be found online, provided you knew what department had created it and what number to search. I knew both. The reference number brought up a planning entry almost immediately. I read it once, then again. 6 weeks before Patricia died, Northline Residential Design had attended a preliminary concept meeting concerning my property. Not Scott's property, mine. I opened the attached summary. The meeting was exploratory. No zoning application had been filed. No permit had been requested. Nothing had reached the stage where the city would have required my signature as owner. That mattered. Whatever Scott and Rebecca had done, I did not want anger turning it into something it wasn't. They had not secretly sold my house. They had not transferred ownership. They had not forged my name on a permit, but they had taken my address into a city planning discussion without ever telling me. I kept reading. The property description was only a few lines long. One phrase stopped me. Pending family-controlled acquisition. I said it aloud. The words sounded worse in my kitchen than they had on the screen. Acquisition. That was not how a son described the house where his parents still lived. I printed the page. My old office habits returned almost automatically. I wrote the date at the top, circled the phrase, and drew a line to the project contact. Northline Residential Design. Scott's company. Rebecca's company. The preliminary concept described removal of the existing residence and replacement with several new units. Removal. That was the polite planning word for demolition. I looked toward the hallway. 31 years of birthdays, Christmas mornings, arguments, repairs, Patricia's book club meetings, Scott's muddy shoes, and all the quiet days nobody remembers until they are gone. On their concept sheet, all of it fit inside 2 words. Existing residence. I scrolled farther. The developer listed in the meeting notes was Gordon Pike. I knew the name, though not personally. Pike had been involved in several residential projects around the county. During my years with the city, I had seen his company name on enough plans to remember it. That did not mean anything by itself. Developers looked at properties constantly. Ideas were discussed and abandoned every week. What mattered was who had brought him this one. According to the summary, Northline had initiated the contact. I leaned back. That answered one question and created three more. How long had Scott been discussing my property with outsiders? What had he told Gordon Pike about ownership? And what exactly did pending mean when the only person who could sell the place had never been asked? I started to reach for my phone, then stopped. Calling Scott angry would give him the advantage of choosing which part to explain first. I wanted to know what Patricia had known before I asked him anything else. I went through her folder again, slower this time. The conceptual plans, the partial financial page, her notes, the photograph of Scott beneath the maple. Then, behind a folded insurance statement, I found a sheet I had overlooked the night before. It was much older than the Northline plans. No company logo, no project number, just a rough drawing on ordinary paper. A small one-story cottage sat near the back of the property. One bedroom, a little porch, wide doorway, nothing fancy. Patricia's handwriting ran along the bottom. Maybe someday. Easier for us? I knew immediately what she meant. For the last few years, she had complained more often about the stairs. Not because either of us was helpless. We were simply getting older, and Patricia had always believed sensible people planned before they were forced to. I could almost hear her voice. One floor, less cleaning, no stairs when our knees started giving us trouble. The sketch was not about profit. It was not about squeezing several buildings onto the lot. It was about two people growing old without giving up the yard they loved. I placed Patricia's cottage sketch beside the Northline plan. The difference was almost cruel. On one page, Patricia had imagined making our life smaller so we could stay independent. On the other, Scott and Rebecca had imagined removing our life entirely and replacing it with a project. For the first time, I wondered whether Scott's claim in Elaine's office might contain a piece of truth. Maybe Patricia had discussed the property with him. Maybe that was where all of this started. But if so, somewhere between her little cottage and Northline's redevelopment plan, the meaning had changed. And nobody had bothered to tell me. There were now two plans for my property. Only one of them looked like something Patricia would have wanted. I called Scott that afternoon. Not because I was ready to accuse him. I wanted to hear how he would explain two plans that could not mean the same thing. He and Rebecca arrived less than an hour later. Scott came in carrying his laptop. Rebecca had a leather portfolio under one arm. Neither of them asked why I had called. That told me enough to begin. I placed Patricia's cottage sketch on the kitchen table. Scott stopped when he saw it. You recognize this? He nodded. Yeah. Then tell me what it is. He sat across from me and opened his laptop. Mom sent me something like that a few years ago. Something like it? Scott found an old email and turned the screen toward me. Patricia's name was at the top. The message was 3 years old. She had written that the stairs were becoming more irritating than either of us cared to admit. She wondered whether a small one-story cottage at the back of the property might make sense someday. She mentioned wider doorways, less maintenance, and enough room for the two of us without giving up the neighborhood. Then came the sentence Scott had apparently remembered best. After both of us were gone, Patricia had written, the main house could become Scott's problem. I almost smiled. That sounded exactly like her. Patricia had a way of making death sound like another household chore somebody would eventually have to handle. Scott leaned back. So when I said Mom wanted this, I wasn't making it up. No, I said. You weren't. His shoulders loosened slightly. Rebecca folded her hands on the table. Thank you. I looked at her. I wasn't agreeing with you. Her expression tightened. I put Patricia's sketch beside the Northline concept plan I had printed that morning. Your mother drew one small cottage so we could stay here more easily as we got older. I tapped the other page. This tears down the house and replaces it with several units. Scott glanced at Rebecca, then back at me. Things evolved. Without me? Dad, we were exploring possibilities. For whose property? Scott rubbed his forehead. Nobody filed anything, nobody sold anything. We were trying to understand what the land could support. I kept my voice level. Why? Rebecca answered before he did. Because the property is underused. There it was. Not sentimental, not complicated, just a business phrase. She continued. You have a large lot in an area where demand is increasing. The original cottage idea made us look at the zoning more seriously. Once we did, it became obvious there were better options. Better for whom? For everyone, potentially. Patricia is dead. The room went still. Rebecca looked down. I hated myself for saying it that way, but I did not take it back. Scott spoke more quietly. Dad, nobody was trying to push Mom out. I didn't say you were. We thought you'd eventually want something smaller. She did too. Eventually. He nodded. That's the word I keep hearing. I pointed to Patricia's email. She said after we were both gone, the main house would become your problem. Scott said nothing. I am not gone. I know that. Then why was my property already in a planning meeting? Rebecca exhaled. Because Northline has already invested money in this. I turned toward her. How much? She hesitated. We're not going into all of that today. You brought it up because you need to understand this isn't just a family conversation anymore. That sentence bothered me more than I expected. I had spent my career listening to people describe decisions as inevitable after they had already spent enough money to become afraid of stopping. We don't have weeks to drag this out, Rebecca said. There are schedules involved. Scott gave her a quick look. I noticed it. Whose schedule? Development schedules, she said. Consultants. Gordon. People don't hold space forever. Gordon Pike again. I leaned back. So he's involved enough that you're worried about his time. We've spoken with him. About land you don't own. About a concept, Rebecca corrected. Scott raised both hands slightly. Dad, nobody is asking you to sign something tonight. That's generous. He looked wounded by the remark. For a moment I saw the boy he had been, and my instinct was to soften the room. Then Rebecca said something that stopped me. Gordon was comfortable looking at it partly because of you. I stared at her. Because of me? Your background. You spent decades with the city. You understand construction. You know what works and what doesn't. I've never met Gordon Pike. No, but Scott's talked about your experience. Scott's jaw tightened. Rebecca seemed to realize she had said more than he wanted her to. I looked from one of them to the other. What exactly did you tell him about me? Scott closed his laptop. Dad, don't turn this into something it isn't. I almost laughed. A week earlier I would have accepted that sentence and wondered whether I was being unfair. Now there was a city record, a project plan, an old family idea stretched beyond recognition, and a developer I had never met who apparently found comfort in my professional history. Rebecca had just told me my experience helped sell a project I had never agreed to join. Rebecca's last sentence stayed with me after they left. She had said Gordon Pike was comfortable looking at Maple Parcel partly because of my background, as though 36 years of my work had somehow become part of Northline's sales pitch without anyone asking whether I wanted my name anywhere near it. I spent the rest of that afternoon doing something I had avoided since Patricia died. I looked backward, not at the project, at Scott. There was a wooden strip inside the pantry door where we had marked his height when he was growing up. Patricia refused to paint over it during every kitchen renovation. Scott at 12. Scott at 14. Scott at 16, when he had finally passed me. I ran my thumb over one of the pencil marks. I had missed too much of those years. Building inspections did not care about Little League schedules or school concerts. There were winters when I left home before Scott woke and came back after dinner. I told myself I was providing for my family. I was. But providing did not mean I had been everywhere I should have been. The trouble came later, when I tried to repay time with money. When Scott's college account came up short one semester, I covered it. When the used car he bought after graduation needed a transmission, I paid for that too. When he and Rebecca's wedding grew beyond the budget they had promised to keep, Patricia and I wrote another check. Then Northline had a rough first year. Scott called one evening and told me payroll was tight. I transferred money the next morning. Every problem had felt different while it was happening. Taken together, they looked remarkably similar. Scott struggled. I worried. Then I made the consequence smaller. Patricia had noticed before I did. Once, after I paid off a credit card Scott had sworn was only for business expenses, she stood at the kitchen sink and said, "Henry, someday that boy is going to think falling doesn't hurt because you keep putting a mattress under him." I had laughed. He's our son. I know exactly who he is. He'll get his footing. Maybe. But he won't learn where the ground is if you keep moving it. At the time, I thought she was being hard on him. Sitting alone at the kitchen table years later, I wondered whether she had been trying to warn me about myself. That did not make Maple Parcel my fault. Scott was 42 years old. Rebecca was 39. They were responsible for what they chose. But I could finally see why Scott might have believed my resistance had an expiration date. My no had too often meant not yet. A knock at the front door pulled me out of the memory. Carolyn Reed stood on the porch holding a glass baking dish covered in foil. She had lived next door for almost 20 years and had known Patricia well enough to walk into our kitchen without asking where the plates were. "I made too much chicken," she said. "You always make too much chicken. That is why neighbors exist." She put the dish in the refrigerator, then glanced toward the backyard. "Are you still doing something with the property?" My hand stopped on the refrigerator door. "What do you mean?" Carolyn frowned. "I thought Patricia mentioned some work a while back." "What work?" "A man was out front taking pictures." "When?" She thought about it. "Maybe 2 months ago. Could have been a little longer." "What kind of pictures?" "Front of the house, driveway, side yard. He had one of those measuring wheels too." "Was he on the property?" "No. Stayed by the sidewalk and curb. That's why I didn't think much of it." I pulled out a chair. "What did his truck say?" Carolyn gave me the company name. I knew it. Not because I had hired them, because I had seen the same firm listed on projects during my years with the city. They did site and development consulting. Carolyn noticed my face. "Henry, I thought you knew." "I didn't." She sat across from me. "There was one other thing." I waited. "He asked me whether you still lived here." The muscles in my shoulders tightened. "What exactly did he say?" Carolyn looked toward the window, concentrating. "He asked if this was the Caldwell property." I said yes. Then he looked at the house and said something like, "Mr. Caldwell is involved too, right?" "What did you tell him?" I said, "Of course. It's his house." She gave a small, uneasy laugh. "I thought he meant involved in whatever work you were planning." I looked through the window at the maple tree. Someone I had never met had stood on the public sidewalk studying my property and already believed I was participating in something. That belief had come from somewhere. Rebecca had said my professional background made Gordon comfortable. Now Carolyn was telling me a consultant had expected me to be involved. 2 separate people, the same assumption. I thanked Carolyn and walked her to the door. After she left, I returned to the kitchen and looked at the papers spread across the table. For days, I had believed Scott and Rebecca were getting ahead of themselves about land they expected to inherit. That was bad enough. But land could not explain why strangers believed I was already part of their plan. Until that moment, I thought they only wanted my land. Now I wondered what else they had already borrowed from me. I called Gordon Pike the next morning. For most of the night, I had imagined the conversation going badly. In my mind, Gordon was already part of whatever Scott and Rebecca had built around Maple Parcel. He would be slick, dismissive, maybe even irritated that the old man whose property they wanted had finally started asking questions. Instead, when his assistant put me through, Gordon sounded confused. "Henry Caldwell?" "That's right." There was a pause. "I've been meaning to meet you. That makes one of us." He gave a short laugh, then stopped when he realized I wasn't joking. I told him I owned the property connected to Maple Parcel. Not partly, not eventually. Now. Then I asked one question. "What exactly do you believe I agreed to?" The silence on his end lasted long enough to change the shape of the conversation. "Scott told me you were supportive of the concept," Gordon said. "I've never discussed any concept with you. I understand that now." "No, I don't think you do." I kept my voice calm. "My wife died Monday morning. Before that, nobody asked me whether I wanted my house demolished, whether I wanted several units built on the lot, or whether I wanted my name connected to any of it." Gordon exhaled slowly. "All right." That was not the response I expected. Not defensive, not angry, just careful. He told me Northline had approached him, not the other way around. Scott and Rebecca had presented Maple Parcel as a family property, likely to become available for redevelopment. Gordon's company had reviewed the concept because the location made sense and because Northline appeared to have a direct path to owner approval. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means I believed this was a family-controlled situation." I almost laughed. Those are the same words in the city record. They came from Northline. There it was. I leaned back in my chair. "What did Scott tell you about ownership?" Gordon hesitated. "He said control was expected to become straightforward once your wife's health situation was resolved." My hand tightened around the pen. Resolved. Gordon did not try to defend the wording. "I'm telling you how it was presented. My wife was dying. I understand that." "No," I said quietly. "You understand it now." Another silence. Then Gordon said, "For what it's worth, Mr. Caldwell, I was under the impression you knew about the discussions." "Why?" "Because Scott said you would likely be involved on the project side." That matched what Rebecca had hinted at. I wrote the sentence down. likely be involved. Did I sign anything? No. Did you receive an email from me? No. Did I authorize anyone to negotiate for my property? Not that I have. His answers were immediate. That mattered. Whatever else Gordon Pike might have been, he did not sound like a man trying to manufacture permission after the fact. What contract do you have on my land? I asked. None. Option agreement? No. Purchase agreement? No. Letter of intent from me? No. For the first time since finding Maple Parcel, some of the pressure behind my ribs eased. Scott and Rebecca had moved farther than they had any right to move, but they had not trapped me legally. Not yet, Gordon continued. What we have is preliminary design discussion. That's all, and after this call I'm pausing it. You don't need to do that for my benefit. I'm not. His answer surprised me. I don't spend development money on property when the owner tells me he didn't authorize the conversation. That sounded less like kindness than business sense. I respected it more because of that. Then he added something I had not known. We've been holding a development review slot through next Monday. After that, I moved the team onto another site. Next Monday? Yes. I thought about Rebecca sitting at my table. We don't have weeks to drag this out. Now I knew why. There was a clock running. Scott and Rebecca had known it. I hadn't. How long has that Monday date been on the schedule? A few weeks. I wrote that down too. 1 week after Patricia's death. 1 week after Scott's first question about the house. I hated the connection my mind made, even before I had enough information to prove what it meant. Gordon cleared his throat. There's something else. I waited. You said nobody asked you to be involved. That's right. I think you should see the way Northline presented the project to us. My pen stopped. What way? I'd rather you read it yourself. There was movement on his end, then the sound of a keyboard. I'm emailing the presentation now. A few seconds later, my computer chimed. The subject line read, Maple Parcel Development Concept. I thanked Gordon and ended the call. For a moment I just looked at the unopened email. Then I clicked. The first pages were exactly what I expected. Property photographs, market notes, concept drawings, development assumptions. I moved through them slowly. Page 4, page 5, page 6. Then page 7 loaded. I stopped breathing for a second. There was my photograph, my career, and beneath my name, a job title nobody had ever asked me to accept. I stared at page 7 until the words stopped looking like English. Under my photograph were 3 lines. Henry Caldwell, retired municipal building inspector, proposed project advisor. I read them again, then once more, slower. Nobody at Northline had ever asked me to advise Maple Parcel. Nobody had even told me Maple Parcel existed. Yet there I was, presented as though I had agreed to stand beside it. The photograph bothered me almost as much as the title. It had been taken at Scott's company opening 5 years earlier. Patricia had insisted I wear a jacket because she said my usual plaid shirt made me look like I was about to inspect the ceiling tiles. Scott had been proud that day. So had I. I clicked to the next slide. At the top were the words family support. Beneath them was a quotation. Scott has always seen possibilities other people miss. My sentence. I knew exactly where it came from. Scott had asked me to write a few lines for Northline's first website. I had sat at this same kitchen table and tried to put into words what I admired about my son. That sentence had been about him, not about my property, not about demolishing my house, not about Maple Parcel, but placed beneath my photograph and that invented advisory title, it looked like an endorsement. I pushed away from the computer. For several minutes I could not continue. Taking my land for granted was one thing. Using my own pride in my son to make that assumption look legitimate was another. When I finally returned to the presentation, I stopped looking at the pictures. I went to the numbers. Northline had already spent $18,600 on preliminary design work, consultant review, and site feasibility. Farther down was projected revenue if the project moved forward. Approximately $74,000 in design, pre-construction, and project management work. I sat very still. Rebecca's words came back to me. We already have money in this. Now I knew how much, and I knew what they expected to get back. This was no longer 2 younger people sketching ideas about what might someday happen to family property. They had put money behind the assumption. They had built income around it. I clicked back through the deck. A phrase on the final planning page caught my attention. Owner confirmation expected Monday. Monday. I checked the date. September 21st. 5 days away. The meaning arrived slowly, then all at once. Patricia had died on Monday morning. Scott had known this deadline existed. His first question after I told him his mother was gone had been about the house. I closed my eyes. For the first time since that phone call, I understood that his question might not have been merely cold. It had been urgent. Somewhere in Scott's business calendar, my wife's death had landed beside a deadline. I hated that thought. I also refused to exaggerate it. Scott had not caused Patricia's illness. He had not wanted his mother dead, but he had built a plan whose timing became easier after she was gone. There was a difference between wishing for someone's death and preparing to benefit from what came after it. The difference mattered. So did the preparation. I printed the presentation. Then I opened a blank document. For 36 years, I had watched disagreements become expensive because people relied on conversations nobody could later prove. I was not going to make that mistake in my own house. I wrote slowly. I stated that I was the sole owner of the property. I stated that I had never authorized Northline Residential Design to represent me, negotiate for me, use my professional background in connection with Maple Parcel, or describe me as a project advisor. I stated that I had not approved demolition, redevelopment, sale, or transfer of the property. I asked that my photograph, testimonial, and professional history be removed from all project materials. Then I wrote the sentence that mattered most. I do not consent to Maple Parcel proceeding on the assumption of my approval. I read everything twice. Old habit. Then a third time, because this was Scott. That was the part that hurt. I had spent years teaching my son that if he waited long enough, explained hard enough, or struggled badly enough, my answer might soften. I had helped create that expectation. I could not change those years. I could change this morning. I emailed the notice to Scott. Then Rebecca. Then Northline's general business address. Finally, Gordon Pike. Within 10 minutes, Gordon replied. Received. All Maple Parcel activity remains paused, pending direct written authorization from you. There would be no such authorization. Scott called before I finished printing Gordon's response. I watched his name light up the screen. Once, twice, 3 times. I did not answer. Not because I was afraid of him, because there was nothing left to clarify by telephone. My answer was already written. For the first time in Scott's life, my no wasn't the beginning of a negotiation. It was the end of one. Scott waited until the next afternoon before coming back. This time, Rebecca was with him, and neither of them brought food. Scott carried a blue folder. Rebecca carried her laptop. I knew before they sat down that they had come to turn my written no into something they could work around. We're not asking you to sell the house, Scott said. He placed the folder on my kitchen table as carefully as if that distinction solved everything. Then what are you asking? A compromise. Rebecca opened the folder and slid a document toward me. The title read, Exclusive Development Consulting Agreement. I looked at Scott. This isn't a deed, he said quickly. It doesn't transfer ownership. It just protects the work Northline has already done if you ever decide to move forward later. Standard agreement, Rebecca added. I had heard that phrase hundreds of times during my career. Standard contract, standard change order, standard procedure. People often used the word standard when they hoped you would stop reading. I put on my glasses. Scott shifted in his chair. Dad, Elaine can review it if you want. She probably will. I turned to the first page. But I'm reading it first. The agreement did not give Northline my property. That much was true. Instead, it gave the company an exclusive role if I pursued redevelopment based on the Maple Parcel concept during a stated period. Northline would coordinate with developers, provide design and pre-construction services, and receive agreed fees if the project advanced. There was also language protecting Northline if I later used substantial portions of its concept with another developer. On paper, it sounded reasonable. If I had hired them, if I had requested their work, if I had asked them to spend $18,600 developing an idea for my property, I had done none of those things. I turned another page. Scott tried to explain. This keeps you in control. You don't have to do anything right now. And if 6 months from now I decide I want something different, you can, with Northline involved. If you use our work. Work I never ordered. Rebecca leaned forward. The work exists, Henry. Pretending it doesn't helps nobody. I'm not pretending anything. I tapped the document. I'm trying to understand why the solution to work I didn't authorize is giving your company rights over decisions I haven't made. Scott rubbed the bridge of his nose. Nobody is trying to control you. I continued reading. There were termination provisions, reimbursement language, and references to future developer coordination. Nothing screamed theft. That almost made the document more dangerous. It took the unreasonable assumption beneath maple parcel and dressed it in reasonable language. I reached the signature page and closed the agreement. Who wrote this? Our attorney reviewed it, Rebecca said. That wasn't my question. Scott looked down at the table. Rebecca prepared most of the first draft. Rebecca turned toward him. It was based on our regular consulting documents. Scott looked at me. She handles most of our contracts. That matched what I had seen in their business for years. Scott was better with people and ideas. Rebecca was the one who turned conversations into schedules, budgets, and paperwork. I slid the agreement back across the table. I'm not signing it. Rebecca did not touch it. Can I ask why? You already know why. No, I know you're angry. That isn't the same thing. I felt my jaw tighten. This has nothing to do with anger. It has everything to do with timing, she said. Patricia just died. You're grieving. Nobody expects you to make a development decision tomorrow. Then why are you asking me to sign something today? That stopped her. Scott looked toward the window. Rebecca recovered first. Because Northline needs clarity. So do I. You're acting as if we're strangers trying to take something from you. You used my photograph, my career, and my words in a presentation I had never seen. We've removed them. After I found out. She inhaled slowly. Then she said the sentence that finally stripped the business language away. Henry, this property is going to belong to Scott eventually anyway. Scott's head turned sharply. Rebecca. What? She said. We're all dancing around it. I stared at her. There was no cruelty in her face. That was what made it worse. To her, it was simply arithmetic. An older widower, one adult son, one valuable house, a future asset waiting for time to finish the transfer. I stood. The meeting is over. Scott rose too. Dad, she didn't mean it like that. I know exactly how she meant it. They left the agreement behind. I put it in my briefcase. Not because I planned to sign it, because I had learned long ago never to throw away a document that showed you how someone thought. Later that evening, I began boxing some of Patricia's books for the library donation she had requested. Inside a gardening book, something glossy slipped onto the floor. It was a brochure for a condominium community less than 10 minutes from the library where Patricia had worked. One-story living, elevator access, smaller floor plans. I turned it over. Patricia had circled one model in blue ink. Patricia had spent months protecting my right to stay. I was beginning to wonder whether she had also been protecting my right to leave. The condominium brochure stayed on my kitchen table overnight. I did not call anyone. I did not make a decision. I simply kept looking at the blue circle Patricia had drawn around one of the smaller floor plans. The next morning, I returned to the boxes of books. Patricia owned more books than any two sensible people needed, but she had always rejected that description. According to her, books were not clutter unless they blocked an exit. I smiled for the first time in days. Then I picked up an old hardcover copy of the complete poems of Robert Frost. Patricia had reread it so often that the spine had softened. When I opened the cover, a folded sheet of stationery slipped out and landed against my shoe. My name was written across the front. Henry. I sat down before opening it. The letter was dated 4 months earlier. Patricia had written it during treatment, back when we still spoke carefully about later, without defining what later meant. Her first lines were ordinary. She told me where she wanted certain books donated. She reminded me that the silver serving tray belonged to Scott if he wanted it. She made a joke about not letting Carolyn take her good gardening shears. Then the tone changed. Henry, you have spent your whole life taking care of what needs taking care of. I love that about you. I also worry that someday you will mistake taking care of things for living. I stopped reading. That sentence landed too close. I had spent 31 years maintaining our house. Roof, furnace, driveway, gutters, windows. Every repair had made sense because Patricia and I were building a life there together. Now, every room seemed to come with a list. 3 bedrooms I did not need. A yard that took half a Saturday. Stairs Patricia had avoided more and more during her final year. I continued. Keep the house if waking up there still gives you a life. Keep it because you want the porch, the maple, the neighbors, and the memories. But do not keep it because you think the walls belong to me. Then came the sentence I read 3 times. If leaving this house feels like leaving me, remember this. I was never the house. I lowered the paper. For days I had been fighting Scott and Rebecca over ownership. Who had the right to decide? Who had assumed too much? who had treated my future as something already spoken for. I had never stopped to ask whether I even wanted the thing everyone was fighting over. A memory came back to me from the previous winter. Patricia had been standing at the bottom of the stairs with a basket of laundry. She looked up toward the second floor and said, "A home is supposed to make life easier. The minute it becomes another responsibility, we should be honest about it." I had taken the basket from her. "We're not moving." She smiled. "I didn't say today, Henry." I had heard the sentence. I had not listened to it. Now I looked at the condominium brochure again. That afternoon I drove there. I told myself I was only looking. The community sat less than 10 minutes from Patricia's old library. The buildings were brick and stone, not fancy, with small balconies and trimmed landscaping someone else was responsible for maintaining. A sales representative showed me 2 available units. The first was too dark. The second had 2 bedrooms, an elevator, a small kitchen, and windows facing a row of mature trees. I stood in the living room longer than necessary. There was no place for 31 years of furniture. That felt frightening. Then, unexpectedly, it felt freeing. I imagined waking without a staircase to climb, traveling for a week without worrying about the yard, walking to the library where Patricia had spent 27 years recommending mysteries to people who claimed they hated mysteries. I did not make an offer. I did not sign anything. I thanked the woman and drove home. The maple was visible as soon as I turned into the driveway. For a moment, guilt rose in me. Then I remembered Patricia's letter. Keep it because you want it, not because you are afraid to leave. That evening, I called a real estate agent named Megan Ellis. I chose her because she had no connection to Scott, Rebecca, Northline, or Gordon Pike. "I'm not promising to sell," I told her. "Then we won't treat it like a promise. I want to know what the house is worth, what selling would involve, and what I should expect if I decide to do it. That's enough to start." We arranged for her to visit the following afternoon. After the call, I put Patricia's letter back inside the frost book. For the first time since she died, I considered a future that was not built around protecting what had already happened. I could keep the house. I could sell it. I could choose neither today. The important part was that the decision was mine. Apparently, that possibility frightened Scott and Rebecca more than I realized. 2 days later, Scott learned I might sell, and suddenly he wasn't asking for the house. He was sending me a bill. Scott did not call to ask whether the rumor was true. Rebecca sent an email. The subject line was, "Property Expense Reconciliation." Attached was a spreadsheet totaling a little more than $36,000. I read the number twice before opening the file. The first column listed dates. The second described expenses. The third named vendors. The fourth showed amounts supposedly poured for line Scott or Rebecca on behalf of Patricia and me. Roof repair consultation, driveway drainage work, tree service, electrical inspection, bathroom grab bars, minor landscaping. Then, near the bottom, a line large enough to make everything above it look like pocket change. Maple parcel feasibility and preliminary development costs, $18,600. Rebecca had included a note beneath the spreadsheet. "Since you are considering selling the property rather than proceeding with the family plan, we believe it is fair to reconcile expenses incurred for the home's benefit before any sale occurs." Fair. That word did a lot of work. I printed the spreadsheet and carried it to Patricia's desk. If Rebecca wanted reconciliation, I knew how to reconcile records. For most of my career, I had watched people lose arguments because they relied on memory when paperwork existed. I was not going to become one of them at 69. Patricia had kept household bills by year. I started with the roof consultation. Northline had apparently paid $400 to have a contractor look at flashing near the chimney. I found the invoice. Then I found our canceled check. Patricia had reimbursed Scott 5 days later. I drew a line through the amount on Rebecca's spreadsheet. Next came the driveway drainage work, paid directly from our joint checking account. Tree service, same thing. Electrical inspection. Scott had put it on his card because I was at the hospital with Patricia that afternoon. 3 weeks later, I had transferred the exact amount to him. Bathroom grab bars. Rebecca had ordered them online during one of Patricia's difficult weeks. The spreadsheet listed the entire purchase as an unreimbursed family expense. I found Patricia's handwritten note attached to the receipt. Paid Rebecca back. Check cleared. I checked the bank statement. It had. By mid-afternoon, my dining table looked like an accountant had lost a fight with a filing cabinet. Invoices, checks, bank statements, receipts, emails. I kept a yellow pad beside me and reduced the claimed total line by line. Some items were legitimate small costs Scott and Rebecca had covered without repayment. A few grocery runs, one hardware store purchase, a locksmith visit when Patricia misplaced a key during treatment. I was willing to pay those. They had helped us. Help should be acknowledged, but most of the house-related expenses on Rebecca's list had already been paid, reimbursed, or charged to us in the first place. The spreadsheet did not exactly invent them. It simply ignored the second half of their history. I found that more troubling than a mistake. Then I reached the $18,600. There was no reimbursement record because I had never known the expense existed. The supporting documents described site feasibility, preliminary design, planning consultation, and development review. Maple parcel, their project, their decision, their money. Yet Rebecca had placed it beside roof repairs and grab bars, as though all of it belonged in the same category. I began arranging the development invoices by date. That was when I noticed something. Several of the largest charges came late. Very late. I returned to Patricia's email folders. She had printed some messages because, despite spending 27 years around library computers, she trusted paper more than search bars. Behind an oncology appointment schedule, I found a short email exchange. Patricia had written directly to Rebecca. The date was 7 weeks before she died. I read the message slowly. Rebecca, please stop spending money on plans involving our property. Henry has not agreed. I should not have let conversations about the cottage become something larger without speaking to him first. My chest tightened. Patricia had blamed herself too. Even while sick, she had understood the line that mattered. Henry has not agreed. Rebecca's reply came 17 minutes later. One word. Understood. I put the page beside the invoices. Then I checked the dates again. A consultant payment came 4 days after Rebecca's reply. Another design invoice came the following week. A larger feasibility charge came after that. By the time Patricia had clearly told Rebecca to stop, only a fraction of the Maple parcel spending had occurred. Most of the $18,600 had been spent afterward. I sat back and stared at the documents. Rebecca had not misunderstood Patricia's warning. She had acknowledged it. Then, the spending continued. For several minutes, anger was the easiest explanation. But something kept me from calling Scott. The email was addressed to Rebecca alone. Her reply came from her account. Scott was not copied. That did not excuse what he had already done. He knew I had never approved Maple parcel. He had allowed my name into a presentation and talked about my future property as though time were a contract. But this was different. This was proof that Patricia had explicitly told someone to stop. I placed Scott's name at the top of a clean page and wrote one question beneath it. Did he know? The email proved Rebecca knew. What I didn't know yet was whether Scott had ever seen it. Scott came over that evening after I told him I had found an email from Patricia he needed to read. I did not send it to him. I wanted to watch his face when he saw it. Rebecca came with him. She looked tired before she sat down, and for the first time since Maple parcel surfaced, she did not bring a folder or a laptop. I placed Patricia's printed email in front of Scott. Read all of it. He frowned. I already know Mom had concerns. Read it. He picked up the page. His eyes moved down the first paragraph, then stopped. I watched him go back to the beginning. Rebecca said nothing. When Scott reached the line where Patricia wrote that I had not agreed and asked Rebecca to stop spending money, his mouth tightened. Then he read Rebecca's one-word reply. Understood. Scott lowered the page. When did she send this? Rebecca looked at him. You can see the date. That's not what I asked. Her voice stayed controlled. 7 weeks before she died. Scott looked at me, then back at her. You told me she was nervous. She was. You said she needed more time. She did. Scott pushed the paper across the table toward Rebecca. This doesn't say nervous. This says stop. Rebecca's face hardened. I was trying to keep the project from collapsing every time somebody had an emotional reaction. I felt something shift in the room. Not because she had raised her voice. Because she had finally stopped pretending Maple parcel was just an innocent family idea that had somehow gotten too large. Scott stared at her. You never showed me this. No. The answer came quickly. Too quickly for denial. I remembered all the smaller moments that had seemed unimportant before. Scott asking Rebecca for meeting dates. Scott saying she handled contracts. Rebecca correcting him on schedules. Scott looking to her when I asked what Patricia had said during her final weeks. He had let Rebecca manage the machinery of Northline. Now I understood how much of the information had passed through her first. Scott stood. You let me keep putting money into this after Mom told you to stop? Rebecca stood too. We had already invested heavily. That wasn't your decision. We both made the decision. Not with this email sitting in your inbox. She crossed her arms. I believed Henry would eventually agree. I looked at her. Based on what? She turned toward me. Based on years of watching you help Scott. The words hit harder because there was truth in them. You always came through, she continued. Tuition, the wedding, Northline. When something mattered enough to Scott, you found a way. Scott's face changed. Don't put this on, Dad. I'm not. You just did. No, I'm telling you why I thought the risk was manageable. Risk. That was what my future had become to her. A manageable risk. Scott began pacing near the kitchen counter. You made me look like an idiot. Rebecca's voice sharpened. You didn't need my help for that part. You knew Henry hadn't signed anything. Scott stopped. I let the silence sit, because she was right, and because I was not going to let Scott walk out of my kitchen believing Rebecca's lie had turned him into a victim. I pointed to the chair. Sit down. He looked at me. Dad, she hid this from me. I know. I would have handled things differently. Maybe. He frowned. That's all you have to say? No. I leaned forward. You didn't see Patricia's email. I believe you. Scott glanced toward Rebecca as though that should settle something. It doesn't erase the rest. His expression tightened. What rest? You used my photograph. He looked down. You used my professional history. He said nothing. You allowed Gordon Pike to believe I supported Maple Parcel. You described control of my property as something likely to happen after your mother's health situation was resolved. That was badly worded. It was badly thought. Scott flinched. And Monday morning, while your mother was still in our bedroom, you asked me what happened to the house because you knew you had a development deadline coming. His face went pale. Rebecca looked away. You knew I had never said yes, I continued. You didn't need Rebecca's email to know that. Scott sat quietly. For once, there was no immediate explanation. No argument. No request that I see his side. My phone rang on the table. Gordon Pike. I answered. He told me he wanted one final meeting the next morning. Scott and Rebecca would be there. Gordon wanted the ownership issue, Northline's representations, and Maple Parcel formally closed out with everyone present. I agreed. After I hung up, Scott asked, "What does he want?" To finish this. Scott nodded slowly. Then he looked at Rebecca. For the first time since Patricia died, they did not look like partners defending the same position. Scott thought Rebecca's secret changed who was responsible. The next morning, he was going to learn that being misled doesn't erase the choices you made willingly. The next morning, I arrived at Gordon Pike's office 10 minutes early. Scott and Rebecca were already there. Rebecca had brought the blue Northline folder again. Scott had nothing in his hands. That difference told me more than either of them said. Gordon led us into a conference room overlooking a parking lot and a row of unfinished townhouses. A large monitor hung on the wall. On the table were printed copies of the Maple Parcel presentation, Patricia's email, my no-consent notice, and the ownership record showing the house belonged to me alone. Nobody bothered with coffee. Scott spoke first. I think we can simplify this. Gordon sat across from him. How? A smaller project. Fewer units. Dad keeps more control. We don't need to throw away everything that's already been done. Rebecca nodded. We could revise the concept quickly. I looked at them. Even after everything, they had come expecting negotiation. Gordon turned toward me. Mr. Caldwell, before we discuss any revised concept, I need to clear up something basic. Go ahead. He opened the presentation on the monitor. Page 7 appeared. My photograph filled the left side of the screen. Henry Caldwell, retired municipal building inspector, proposed project advisor. Gordon looked at me. Can you confirm whether you agreed to serve in this role? I stared at the screen for a moment, then looked at him. My what? Scott closed his eyes briefly. Gordon repeated the question. Did you agree to act as project advisor? No. Did you authorize Northline to present you that way? No. Did you authorize the use of your photograph or professional background in connection with Maple Parcel? No. Gordon turned to Scott. Do you have written authorization? Scott glanced at Rebecca. She did not move. No. An email? No. A signed engagement? No. Anything from Mr. Caldwell confirming he supported the project? Scott's voice grew quieter. No. Gordon clicked to the family support page. My old sentence appeared beneath my photograph. Scott has always seen possibilities other people miss. Was this statement written specifically for Maple Parcel? Gordon asked. I answered, no. I wrote it years ago for Northline's first website. Gordon nodded once and closed the presentation. Then he placed Patricia's email in the middle of the table. Rebecca's one-word reply sat directly beneath her mother-in-law's request to stop spending money on plans involving our property. Understood. Beside that, Gordon placed my written no consent notice. Then the ownership record. 3 documents, 3 dates, 1 clear line. Patricia had said stop. I had never said yes. And I owned the property. Scott leaned forward. I didn't see Patricia's email until last night. Gordon looked at him. I understand. So that matters. It matters when I decide what you personally knew. Scott seemed relieved for half a second. Then Gordon continued. It does not change what Northline represented to us. The relief disappeared. Gordon tapped the presentation. Northline represented owner support. He tapped the planning summary. Northline described this as a pending family-controlled acquisition. Then he looked directly at Scott. And Northline represented future control of the property as sufficiently likely for us to reserve time, review the site, and evaluate the concept. Scott shifted in his chair. We believed control would eventually transfer. That is not control. Gordon's voice never rose. That made it more final. An expectation of inheritance is not ownership. A family relationship is not authorization. And a possible future transfer is not something my company can treat as available property. Rebecca finally spoke. We never claimed to own it. No, Gordon said. You created enough certainty around future control that we behaved as though owner approval was a formality. The word hit me. Formality, exactly how Scott had treated me. Not as the owner. As the last signature they expected to collect. Gordon folded his hands. My company is formally closing Maple Parcel. Scott stared at him. Completely? Yes. What if Dad changes his mind later? Then Mr. Caldwell may contact whoever he chooses. I said nothing. Scott sank back. Rebecca asked the next question. And Northline's relationship with your company? Gordon paused. We were considering Northline for pre-construction work on the Fairmont project. Rebecca's face changed. That's separate. It was. It was. Gordon's answer was calm. But our decisions about consultants depend on trust in how they represent authority, ownership, and client support. Scott leaned forward. You're dropping us from Fairmont over this? I'm removing Northline from consideration. That project had nothing to do with my father's property. No, Gordon said. But the judgment that created this problem came from the same company. Silence filled the room. There was no dramatic shouting. No lawyer storming in. No secret document appearing at the last second. Just the consequences of facts already sitting on the table. Maple Parcel was dead, and Northline had lost something beyond it. Trust. Gordon stood. The meeting was over. Outside, Rebecca walked toward their car without speaking. Scott stayed beside me on the sidewalk. For several seconds he stared at the pavement. Then he looked up. He didn't ask how to save Maple Parcel. He asked whether I would save him. Scott waited until we were back at my house before asking. He followed me into the kitchen while Rebecca drove home alone. For once he did not bring a folder, a proposal, or an explanation prepared in advance. He just sat at the table. I need help. The words were familiar. Too familiar. I took off my coat and hung it over the back of a chair. With what? Scott looked down at his hands. Northline is in worse shape than I told you. I did not interrupt. We counted on me. How bad? He rubbed his palms together. If I can replace what we lost on the preliminary work, we can stabilize things. I knew the number before he said it. $18,600. He looked up. Exactly. I almost admired the symmetry. That was the amount Northline had spent after deciding my property was something they could plan around. Now Scott wanted me to replace it. A loan? I asked. Yes. Or an advance against what I'll eventually inherit. Whatever makes you more comfortable. The words inheritance advance sat badly between us. Scott must have seen it. I'm not trying to sound entitled. You're asking me to give you money now because you expect some of mine later. He winced. When you say it like that, how should I say it? He had no answer. Then he tried the argument I knew was coming. Dad, Rebecca hid Mom's email from me. I know. If I had seen it, I would have stopped. Would you? His face tightened. Yes. I wanted to believe him. That was the dangerous part. Scott was not lying about everything. Rebecca had withheld something important. Patricia had told her plainly to stop, and Scott had not seen that message. That mattered. It gave me a real reason to feel sorry for him. But sympathy was not the same as innocence. "You didn't know about that email," I said. "But you knew I had never approved the project." Scott stared at the table. "You knew I hadn't agreed to advise anyone." Silence. "You knew the house was still mine." He nodded once. "And you still let Gordon think control was coming?" "We thought it was." "That's the problem." Scott looked up. "I know I handled it wrong." "No, you handled it the way you've handled a lot of things." He frowned. I sat across from him. "When something goes badly, you come to me after the damage is done." "That's not fair." "Tuition shortfall." He looked away. "The transmission." "Dad." "The wedding." His jaw tightened. "Northline's first bad year." That was different. It always was. That was the sentence Patricia had been trying to teach me for years. Every rescue came with a reason. Every emergency was special. Every check felt like the last one. Until the next one. Scott leaned back. "So you're really going to let my company go under because I made one bad decision?" "One?" He did not answer. I stood and walked to the drawer beside the refrigerator. Scott watched me. He knew that drawer. I had kept my checkbook there for more than 20 years. When Scott needed tuition money, I had opened that drawer. When the transmission failed, I had opened it. When he and Rebecca ran over their wedding budget, I had opened it. When Northline could not make payroll, I had opened it. I pulled the drawer toward me. Scott's shoulders loosened. Not much. Just enough. He thought he knew how this ended. I took out the checkbook. Then I reached into the pantry for a small cardboard box I had been using to pack personal papers. I put the checkbook inside. Scott stared at me. "What are you doing?" "Moving it." "Dad." "No loan." His face went still. "No advance on an inheritance." "Henry." "No access to this property. No agreement giving Northline future rights. And my name does not appear in another proposal, presentation, testimonial, or business conversation without my written permission." Scott stood. "You'd rather lose me than help me?" I looked at him. "That is not what I'm doing." "It feels like it. I'm refusing to make your consequence disappear." He shook his head. "You can afford $18,600. "Yes." That answer stopped him. I did not pretend poverty. I did not pretend the money would ruin me. I could write the check. That was exactly why refusing mattered. "Every time I saved you from a consequence," I said, "I taught you the consequence wasn't real." Scott's eyes dropped. "I should have stopped doing that years ago." For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he picked up his coat. At the door, he turned. "What happens if Northline fails?" "I don't know." "You really mean that?" "Yes." He left. I carried the box upstairs and placed it in the closet beside Patricia's papers. For the first time, closing the drawer downstairs did not feel cruel. It felt finished. 3 weeks later, I signed the contract to sell my house, and Scott had no idea what I planned to do with $1 of it. 3 weeks after Scott left my kitchen without a check, I signed a contract to sell the house. There was no developer waiting behind the curtain, no clever scheme, no dramatic auction. Megan listed it the ordinary way. A retired couple from Cincinnati made an offer after their second visit. They liked the backyard, the wide driveway, and the old maple near the fence. Before I accepted, I asked one thing. "If you can, keep that tree." The husband looked through the window. "The maple?" "Yes." He smiled. "My wife already said she wants a bench under it." That was enough. Scott's maple would stay, even though Maple Parcel never would. I did not tell Scott the sale price. I did not send him the contract. I did not ask whether he approved of the buyers or what he thought I should do with the money. Those habits had ended with the check I did not write. I bought the smaller condominium near Patricia's old library. 2 bedrooms, 1 elevator, no lawn mower, no gutters, no staircase waiting for my knees to surrender. After paying for the condominium and setting aside what I needed for taxes and moving expenses, the rest of the proceeds went where I decided they belonged, with my retirement savings, protected for the years I still had ahead of me. For the first time in decades, I owned less house and felt as though I had more room. Patricia's estate took longer to settle. When Scott finally received his $25,000 bequest, Elaine gave him a short note Patricia had left with it. Scott showed it to me at breakfast several weeks later. It said, "This is a gift. Gifts are given. They are not collected." He folded the note carefully and put it back in his wallet. For once, he did not make a joke. Northline survived, but not the way Scott and Rebecca had imagined. They closed the expensive showroom before winter. The polished glass conference room Rebecca had once been so proud of disappeared with it. They moved into a smaller office over a flooring store and let 2 employees go when there was not enough work to keep them. Fairmont never came back. Neither did Gordon. Scott picked up kitchen remodels, additions, and small commercial jobs that would once have seemed too ordinary for the company he wanted Northline to become. They paid their own losses. Slowly. Without me, that may have been the most important thing that happened to all of us. Rebecca came to see me alone in February. She stood in my condominium living room holding her coat instead of taking it off. "I owe you an apology," she said. I waited. Not every apology deserves help finishing. She looked toward the window. "I treated your future like an asset on our balance sheet." I said nothing. I kept thinking about what the property could become, what Northline could earn, what Scott would inherit. I stopped thinking about the fact that you were still living your life. Her eyes came back to mine. I was wrong. It was the first apology she had given me that did not contain the word "but." I accepted it. I did not erase what happened. Those are different things. Scott and Rebecca never received another key to my home. They did not get access to my accounts. I stopped discussing my estate plan with them. When Scott once asked whether I had updated my will after moving, I told him I had handled what needed handling. He nodded and changed the subject. That mattered too. My own days changed in smaller ways. I began volunteering 2 mornings a week at Patricia's library. Mostly I shelved, donated books, and helped with the annual sale. The first time I walked behind the circulation desk, I could almost hear Patricia telling me I was putting something in the wrong section. Maybe I was. I started taking longer walks. I learned that one person could cook a decent dinner without producing enough leftovers to feed 6. And once a month, Scott and I met for breakfast at a diner halfway between our homes. At first, we talked about safe things. Weather, baseball, a leaking roof on one of his projects. Eventually, we talked about Patricia. Those breakfasts did not restore what we had been. I did not want them to. I wanted whatever came next to be built differently. A year after Patricia died, I woke before sunrise. I made coffee and sat by the window with one of her old books. At 7:23, my phone rang. "Scott," I answered. "Morning." There was a brief pause. Then my son asked, "Dad, how are you doing today?" I looked down at the coffee in my hand. No question about the house, no money, no inheritance, no request waiting behind his concern. "I miss her," I said. "Me too." We talked for almost 20 minutes. Nothing remarkable happened, and that was exactly why it mattered. When we hung up, I sat there for a while thinking about the question Scott had asked 1 year earlier and the one he had asked now. I did not mistake one good phone call for complete change. I did not need to. It was enough that he was finally learning to ask about the person before the property. The morning Patricia died, my son asked what would happen to the house. A year later, the house belonged to someone else. My money belonged to my future. My son's choices belonged to him, and my life, at last, belonged to me.